Critical theory, application, critique, new history, and reader response. Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio, by Pulitzer Prize-winning poet James Wright, is one of numerous publications where Wright offers readers an inside glimpse into life growing up in Martins Ferry, Ohio, across the river from Wheeling, West Virginia. Critic Alexander Minrisky, assistant professor of English at the University of Connecticut, employs new history criticism as a lens from which to underscore the political underpinnings of Wright's literary work, highlighting Wright's reflections on the injustices faced by Appalachians. Minrisky introduces two primary argument points relative to Wright's work. First, Wright struggled with place-based identity due to the implications of how cultural influences ultimately impact an individual. For while Wright felt deeply connected to the natural habitat of Martins Ferry and the Appalachian backdrop, he felt anything but connected to the people that lived there, who he attributed as enabling industrialization's desolation of the natural resources. And secondly, Wright's poetry demonstrates the complicated relationship between politics and identity, for even though Wright felt an aversion to the community, he showcased the injustices the people of the town experienced due to political exploitation. For example, according to Minrisky, Wright felt his poetry should deal with the hell of our lives, specifically the environs and people of Martins Ferry. Furthermore, Minrisky argues that Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio, situates Wright in his Shreve High football stadium, even though he spent adult years attempting to disassociate with the people and resulting environmental atrocities that were related to coal identity politics. The first stanza of the poem introduces readers to forlorn locals, and according to Minrisky, collectively, these lines represent the condition of the residents' lives, as together the people of Martins Ferry and Wheeling, Wright included, weathered shared environmental conditions. Minrisky's focus on how Wright struggled with place-based identity, wanting to completely disassociate himself from the exploitative nature of the townspeople, and industrial companies facilitating such environmental degradation, yet choosing to incorporate his personal affiliations with these events, demonstrates a new historical methodology of review. Scholar Jerome Mazzaro published a critique of James Wright's early poetry via elements of both new history and reader response methodologies. Mazzaro informs readers that Wright himself, in personal interviews, refers to his poetic style as one that embraces neoclassical leanings. According to Mazzaro, a neoclassical artist like Wright perceives nature through rules provided by earlier artists. Here, Mazzaro's argument seems to suggest a perpetuation of self-declared societal influences filters its way into Wright's literary works, therefore impacting the meaning of said works, an ideology that diverges from new criticism's theoretical premises. It becomes increasingly clear in the critique that Mazzaro's analysis focuses on how the work of other poets has outright influenced Wright's methodologies. In doing so, Mazzaro incorporates elements of reader response literary criticism, focusing on how readers receive the work in order to generate the meaning of the text. There is enough sympathy in Wright's poetry for the normative, the rational, the enduring, the decorous, and the restrained to benefit from using several elements in Reynolds, referring to Sir Joshua Reynolds' artist's approach. Furthermore, Mazzaro states, responses to the volume, the collection of Wright's work, identify Wright's faults and strengths. Readers who object to the poetry find ideology triumphing over intellect. However, Mazzaro argues that political influences of the time may have very well influenced The Branch Will Not Break, a collection of Wright's works that were published in 1963, featuring Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio. For example, Mazzaro contends lyrics brought to suburban Middle America the sufferings of the poor and emotional responses to injustice. With their dreams of unionism, compassion, and fraternal solidarity, the out of work, the exploited, the excluded, the lonely, the forgotten, the fugitive, and the self-destructive became heroic. Thematic elements included in Wright's work. According to Mazzaro, the scene in Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry narrows to a home with fathers and mothers, and ends within the stadium on sons who have grown suicidally beautiful, galloping terribly against each other's bodies. Here, Mazzaro argues these scenes foster interpersonalism by affecting identically the poet and his audience, resulting in a critique that demonstrates intersectionality between new history and reader response criticism. Minrisky's critique aligns with the biblical worldview in that it highlights Wright's response to sin. For example, Minrisky argues that Wright struggles with place-based identity and flees Martins Ferry, Ohio to pursue college, eventually teaching in several universities. Minrisky highlights that Wright's uncomfortableness and internal conflict of recognizing the evilness surrounding the small town, from the exploitation of the workers to the detrimental effects of the environment. Minrisky's critique suggests that Wright unsuccessfully tries to distance himself from the darkness affiliated with Martins Ferry, an ideology that could be representative of mankind's attempt to resist sin. Yet the inclusion of these topics and life experiences in Wright's poetry may symbolize the frustration of mankind's weakness to sin, and even in intentional resistance, manifestation of the undesired associations still occurs. Minrisky's critique showcases how, no matter what, Wright is unable to change history or change the effects of historical events. Likewise, no matter how guilty we, being Christians, feel about our sinful nature or acts of sin, we no longer have the ability to change our human condition in solidarity with Wright's experiences. This realization supports biblical scripture and that God's mercy and grace transcend our feeble attempts to alter our Constitution. Mazzaro's critique is more complex to assess in that it introduces principles related to a Christian worldview, but the results of the analysis are somewhat difficult to ascertain. For example, in Mazzaro's critique, he expands on how Wright's philosophies were influenced by others, such as Arthur Schopenhauer, who invoked presentation of the world as an idea acted upon by will or spirit. Going further, Mazzaro contends Wright seems to have gained a sense of the present impossibility of Christian belief at the same time that its emotions are being preserved. Christian imagery and illusion function to remind rather than to relieve. Based upon this evidence, Mazzaro at least offers a means by which to consider how a Christian worldview may have influenced Wright's work. Regardless, Mazzaro's critique ultimately supports biblical scripture in that it places focus on the sinful nature of the world and how those we surround ourselves with will ultimately influence our actions. For example, Mazzaro argues nature enticed and seduced man into violence, love, waste, error, action, and freedom via analysis of one of Wright's other poems. However, these elements are indicative of the fall. When the serpent introduced the apple to Eve, when Eve convinced Adam to take a bite in opposition of God's commandment. Without Eve's influence, we don't know if Adam would have disobeyed God.